Gravekeepers have become an out-of-sync archetype in a sense, for they have some nice spell and trap card support that has stood the test of time, including one of the top spell cards in the game, in Necrovalley, that is a constantly splashed tech in a number of decks to act as a floodgates of sorts against Tier 1 decks. Unfortunately, outside of basically one particular monster, the rest of their monsters have not stood the test of time well. Thus, Gravekeeper decks on a whole have not stood on their own in competition outside of the pseudo Dark Law Gravekeeper deck and the Card of Demise variant. Before the release of Card of Demise, the main problem with running a pure Gravekeeper deck is the aforementioned point that a vast majority of the monsters are older and have lost a lot of their usefulness, especially without Necrovalley on the field. Thus, it became almost a Necrovalley essential deck, where if it wasn't on the field, you'd have almost no real chance of winning. This problem is further exasperated by the fact that Gravekeepers come off as kind of a stally, swarmy theme deck with regards to its monsters, yet it does not have much of the swarming capacity outside of Gravekeeper Spy. Overall, the resurgence of Gravekeepers has pretty much been driven by the existence of Card of Demise. A quick overview of the Gravekeeper archetype will identify why this is generally the case, but that won't stop us necessarily, because while the principal deck build will be Card of Demise based, I will also show a Gravekeeper deck that does not run Card of Demise that isn't bad. It's not as competitive, but for those who don't want to run Card of Demise, it's definitely a valid alternative. Alright, let's get started. One of the newer boss-type monsters for the Gravekeepers is Oracle. Unfortunately, Oracle is rather pathetic because, while it is easy to put on the field, its associated effects, even if all three activate, because you elected to tribute 3 Gravekeeper monsters for some reason, are lackluster and definitely not worth the tributes. Realistically, the original boss monster, Chief, completely outclasses this card, and realistically, this card is just not worth the paper it's printed on. I feel sorry, in a sense, for the other newer boss-type monster, Visionary, for when it was released, I don't think it received the respect in a sense it deserved. I think it was a lot better than a lot of people thought it was. Self-protection from destruction with no once-per-turn limit is always a good thing, and the activation of this self-protection actually produces a secondary benefit, in this case increasing its attack points. With Gravekeepers having their own archetype-specific salvage, giving up Gravekeeper monsters from the hand is certainly not as meaningful of a cost as it is for other decks, and new fuel can be added much easier. Also, Visionary's traits allow for it to be summoned multiple ways, instead of just having to resort to tribute summoning it. But even then, you get a nice little break from Visionary, because instead of having to use 2, you can only use 1 Gravekeeper monster. Unfortunately, Visionary's anti-destruction effect has become somewhat power creep. It's too bad. Shaman is an okay card that works in combination with Necrovalley to basically cripple graveyard shenanigans or utility for the opponent. Shaman's not a bad card, but it really does not help enough, in my opinion, to advance the offensive position of the deck versus other cards that can be run, especially in a Card of Demise deck. Similar to Visionary, I feel a little bad for Chief because it would have been a much better card if the Gravekeeper archetype had a better assortment of monsters. It is basically a free, at least 1900 attack point monster with a little extra versatility in what you can actually use its effect to summon onto the field, which might give you a small advantage. But without that better assortment of monsters and that range of quality versatility, his summons effect is a lot less valuable. The chief problem I have with Heretic is its attack power, for 1800 really should not be able to hold a field early or mid-game, especially in this meta, which is a very high attack point based meta. In my experience, unless it's very late in the game, Heretic does not do enough to warrant running. In a more pure Gravekeeper build, you can get away with running him at 1 because of all the searching. Both of Ambusher's effects are of limited value. The annoyance of its first effect having to be flipped face up is that this monster, having 0 defense, almost guarantees its demise. Also, returning the card to the bottom of the deck instead of the top of the deck, which could have at least screwed up your opponent's next draw, is rather needless. The second effect of Necrovalley, Recovery, is also rather worthless because if you run out of Necrovalley, Ambusher is really not going to save you. Commandant is a must for any Gravekeeper deck, for it, like other field searchers of its ilk, is a monster version of terraforming with that nice versatility between being able to grab that Necrovalley from the deck in addition to just thinning your deck 1, or using him as a 1600 or 2100 with Necrovalley on the field attack point monster when you need that power. 3 copies. Assailant is an oldie for this deck, but still good enough for with Necrovalley it is a 2000 attack point monster that can destroy a large number of opponents due to its position switching effect. The effect certainly is not the most useful or sexy effect, but it definitely has its uses. 1 copy. I really don't know or understand why people run multiple copies of Descendant, for it is a good example of one of the general problems with Gravekeeper. Outside of the combination with Spy's effect, Descendant does not have a lot of net utility because it cannot tribute itself. Descendant costs on-field resources, yet Gravekeepers do not have a quality and consistent means to reacquire those resources outside of just continuing to try to go back into the Spy well, which runs out pretty quickly. In some respects, it could be argued that Snipe Hunter is a better card for this deck, because while its effect is not guaranteed, it takes resources from the hand, which Gravekeepers are much better at restoring, in addition to not losing future field presence. However, because Descendant does have Gravekeeper in its name, thus making it searchable, I run 1 copy. Spear Soldier was one of the original Guard, and when it was created, piercing somewhat had a place. But now, when is piercing as a direct effect ever actually valuable? No copies. In my mind, Cannon Holder has always been basically inferior to its more generic partner, Cannon Soldier, because of the cannot tribute itself restriction. Even having Gravekeeper in its name doesn't get it over that. It's just inferior hump. No copies. Spy is still the best Gravekeeper monster and should always be run at 3 in every build. A 2500 defense wall with Necrovalley is rather significant, although not as much as it used to be in other past metas versus this current meta. Obviously, the most important element to Spy, though, is its special summons from the deck. This effect and its high defense make Spy the chief rank 4 driver for this deck. Guard was once a nice card, and is still okay, for it can remove annoying cannot be destroyed, or spell, trap, effect negators that your opponent may put on the field. Also, at 2400 defense with Necrovalley on the field, it can be annoying at times to get over without card effects. Unfortunately, without that explosive swarming capacity, in the end, Guard is just a single-use stall card. There are better choices for a Card of Demise Gravekeeper deck. Watcher is just bad in so many ways. There just are so many better cards. Recruiter is a nice card for this deck because the deck is stun-centric. The advantage of Recruiter is that it receives its search effect regardless of how it's sent to the graveyard from the field. While a number of other decks probably like to run this card at 3, I would imagine, I only run it at 2 copies because I want that deck space for another monster I think is more valuable to winning than a 3rd Recruiter. The creation and idea of Priestess was seemingly an attempt to try to allow the deck to survive without the real McCoy on the field, so to speak. The attempt was not successful. Skip it. In the past, Nobleman was a very important card for increasing the speed of this deck and getting to a card like Visionary. Obvious drawback to Nobleman is that it has to be destroyed as a result of battle when the opponent does the attacking, so it can't suicide itself into a monster. However, in the past, face-down roulette was kind of an issue with Gravekeeper decks, because if you had a face-down Gravekeeper monster, your opponent couldn't just wait on it, because if it was a Spy or a Guard, then that would give you, the Gravekeeper player, much more versatility. There was almost a psychological incentive for your opponent to attack into that face-down monster, because if it was a Spy, it wanted to flip the Spy during its turn so it could better manage the Spy's special summon effect, and not let you just get a free rank 4. Or if it was a Guard, it wanted to have better control over what the Guard could bounce, and therefore there was a higher probability that it could attack into Nobleman. In addition, Nobleman does help produce field control in combination with either Spy or Guard, because the summons occurs in face-down position, so you can use their effects if you choose to summon one of those 2 monsters. Unfortunately, in the Card of Demise version of Gravekeeper, there is certainly not enough deck space for Nobleman, because it does not provide anywhere near the utility it needs to warrant running it. Curse, Vassal, and Charm are all basically worthless and not worth further discussion. As you can see with this monster lineup, one of the biggest problems with Gravekeepers is that on its whole it's just too passive of a deck, especially for the modern meta, forcing it almost to be a stun deck. Well, I guess that's fortunate that Card of Demise came along. Anyways, for the spells and traps, Stele is also an important card for this deck, as it can reload your hand with a nice level of versatility. If you need defense and field control, get Spy. If you need Necrovalley, get Commandant. If you need monster removal and have a Gravekeeper already on the field, get Descendant. Very useful in any build. I run 2 copies with the smaller monster count. Generally in Card of Demise decks, especially this one, 3 copies can definitely be cloggy. Servant is not a useful card in general, although you can build some interesting decks around it. This is definitely not one of those decks. Hidden Temples of Necrovalley is a Gravekeeper-specific version of Vanity's Emptiness, which has its typical out for Gravekeeper monsters. Overall, it can be a nice card, but I feel there are better cards to run, including Vanity's Emptiness itself. Nothing really needs to be said about Necrovalley. Clearly a staple. Run 3 copies. Rite of Spirit is just a Gravekeeper-specific Call of the Haunted, but actually one of the better ones. Most of the archetype-specific Call of the Haunted created in the past were kind of cruddy. Its main purpose is to avoid the influence of Necrovalley. Unfortunately, this deck really does not run anything that's of significant worth summoning it from the graveyard, in my opinion, so no Rite of Spirit. Imperial Tombs of Necrovalley is a nice universal counter trap, which I run at 3 copies for. Having a Gravekeeper monster and Necrovalley on the field is kind of the name of the game in a sense for this deck, so it should be live a lot more often than not. I think this card is much better than a card like Dark Bribe, and I'm someone who tends to support Dark Bribe, but Imperial Tombs of the Necrovalley is just a better card. It has a lower cost ceiling, and it's much more versatile. Finally, there's Royal Tribute. Once the kill card for Gravekeepers, now it's lost a significant level of power in 2 avenues. First, it's limited to 1, which is important because if it's not drawn and activated in the first couple turns, then its usefulness is heavily diminished. Getting it into the hand in a Card of Demise build is definitely easier than your standard build due to the increased speed, but the overall probability is still somewhat low. Second, in the past, losing monsters to the graveyard was almost always bad for the opponent. Now, the total detriment of such an event is hit or miss depending on the opponent's deck, although Necrovalley being on the field certainly does hinder a lot of potential graveyard shenanigans. Overall, the inclusion of Royal Tribute really comes down to player preference, because arguments can be made both for and against it. I side it, but I don't main deck it. For the non-Gravekeeper monsters, I run 1 copy of Glow Bulb to produce some meaningful power via Synchro Summoning. Its Graveyard Summons effect is not hampered by Necrovalley, and if it's discarded via Card of Demise, that's no big deal, because it can just bring itself out from the graveyard. Also, I run 1 copy of Masked Sorcerer, for while it's only a 900 attack point monster, the traps run by this deck will commonly leave an open field for it to attack directly, netting you a card. Another card in this deck, which we'll see later, also significantly increases the utility of this particular card. The other spell cards are rather obvious. The general staple in 1 Raigeki. I don't run Soul Charge, for it's dead most of the time due to Necrovalley. Obviously, I run the 3 copies of Card of Demise, and its partner in crime, so to speak, 3 copies of Pot of Duality, because wherever you find Card of Demise, Pot of Duality is pretty much close behind. I run 1 copy of Upstart Goblin and 1 copy of One Day of Peace for draw power, and this is a kind of a stally deck, so One Day of Peace works. For the traps, in this deck some old faces return in the form of 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, and 1 Solemn Warning. I run 3 copies of Storming Mirror Force and 1 copy of Drowning Mirror Force, for most of the time the opponent will be attacking into a monster, not an open field, making Storming the more active choice than Drowning. On a side note, I really do not understand the fascination with Quaking Mirror Force, for while the affected monsters cannot switch their battle positions, the monsters still remain on the field, so they can defend. You have to actually get rid of them, and they can be tributed. And tributing is kind of a thing in this meta. Eliminating the monsters via Descendant is not cost effective, so I've really never understood why Quaking Mirror Force had become so much more popular than Storming or Drowning Mirror Force. Finally, I run 2 copies of Lose One Turn to stymie opponent explosiveness, for it is live frequently in this deck and rarely affects the monsters you're putting on the field. Also, I run 2 copies of Dark Renewal. Renewal works nicely in this deck because it's a quasi +1 when Recruiter is sent to the graveyard, and it grants quick access to Masked Sorcerer, as well as having the ability to interrupt opponent play without spending that 1500 life points on strike. It must be noted, though, that for Dark Renewal to get second effect, summoning from your deck, you have to send both monsters to the graveyard, so Dark Renewal is definitely sided out for something like Solemn Strike when facing down Pendulums. Overall, though, based on the type of decks you play against, there will be a lot of side decking between Solemn Strikes and other summons, negators, and Mirror Force variants, depending on the level of summoning performed by the opponent and how best you can manage it. The extra deck for this deck is not super important, you're not going to go into it a lot, but is also typically what provides the explosiveness for the deck. I run 1 Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, 2 Hi-Speed Chanbariders. It's the best life point damaging card for this deck in general, I think, and while you can only summon once per turn, the reason I run 2 is because you might normal summon Gloat Bulb from the hand, make it there, and then you'll have a second copy to make on a later turn by bringing out Gloat Bulb from the graveyard. 1 number S39 Utopia the Lightning, 1 S39 Utopia Prime, load up to have Utopia the Lightning's attack increasing ability twice instead of just once, 1 number 39 Utopia, 1 Castel, 1 Dark Rebellion X Z-Dragon, 1 number 66 Master Key Beetle, 1 Evil Swarm Thanatos, 1 Evil Swarm Nightmare, 1 Performamage Trapeze Magician, 1 number 82 Heartland Draco, 1 Abyss Dweller, and 1 Gaga Cowboy. For those who are not interested in running Card of Demise, here's another way of playing Gravekeepers. The general strategy of this non-Card of Demise deck should not be surprising when you're looking at it. Get Visionary on the field, and ride his anti-destruction effect along with other support to victory. While the strategy for this non-Card of Demise Gravekeeper deck is definitely straightforward, this deck works better than one might originally think. However, over the long term, the Card of Demise deck should be better because it is inherently faster and does the same general thing. It just lacks Visionary's field control and power. However, if Card of Demise is limited or banned, this deck is a good, reasonably competitive alternative for those who still want to run Gravekeepers. Overall, when looking at the Card of Demise build, while it does have some strong stall plays, one of the chief weaknesses of the deck is the general lack of physical attack power, with 2100 being the highest attack among main deck monsters, and that is with the assistance of Necrovalley. This lack of attack power is really only a weakness if the opponent attempts to create a stalemate of sorts by simply sitting on a high defense point monster. So that is something to look out for while there are numerous means to deal with an aggressive opponent within this deck, there are not many means to deal with a more passive opponent. Well, that is my Card of Demise and non-Card of Demise Gravekeeper decks. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.